Welcome to another episode of Upbuild Conversations. And this is a very special episode, as is everyone, where the four of us as a full Upbuild team are together. And it's a real pleasure to be with you guys in this space today. So today we're going to be talking about a topic that is pretty much my every experience in life. And it's one that I think I always knew was there growing up, but it wasn't something that I had actively actually spoken about. And that is the link between accomplishment and self-worth. And even in some recent coaching conversations, this has really come up as something that's very important to our clients, something that they're, always thinking about. And I think the reason why that's the case is because there's this cycle of constantly feeling like what I'm doing is not enough. And so I need to do something else, get another accomplishment. And then whether or not I actually get that accomplishment, I still might not feel that sense of worth, and the cycle kind of continues to repeat itself. And so something that is constantly on my mind, and I thought, why not get the four of us together in a space here and kind of unpack this, what's actually going on, what are the things that we should be paying attention to, and how can we actually start to detangle the link between self-worth and accomplishment? Because if we can do that, then ultimately we can have freedom.
That sounds good. Freedom sounds good. I was thinking about, one thing I've thought for a long time is that as I've worked in places where I've had a salary, it's been interesting to feel like to recognize that all of my self-worth was in some ways captured by a number that was on a paycheck every 2 weeks. Like everything that my entire worth was quantified by somebody else. And just when I thought about that, it felt quite disempowering that my worth was determined by a single number, and it was determined by somebody else. And then Michael, when you joined us at Upbuild, we had a bunch of conversations collectively about how we want to really try to decouple our self-worth from the compensation the distribution that we're taking from our work. And I've thought about that a lot over the last 2 years, where it's a really nice idea in theory and a really important one. And then how do we actually do that? Because so much of my worth is entangled with, what have I done? And then how have others valued me? And that's what indicates to me like, oh, okay, I have worth. And so what would it feel like to be in touch with my worth independent of any of that external validation? That must be freedom.
I think when we talk about our self-worth tied to external compensation or some sense of external validation, what I have recognized over time is it's not a clean break, in the sense of there is some degree of our worth that is reflected by our outside environment. And that's where it kind of gets tricky, because we don't know where the line is. How much of the mirroring and the reflection that is happening from the outside world is accurate versus how much of it is projected. And so when the challenge happens, when we don't have a way to really see where the boundary exists.
Wait, yeah, sorry.
that's a
I was just going to ask,
yeah, go ahead.
just what you're saying is that there's a certain amount of self-worth that we derive from the outside world, which is healthy, you're saying. And where do we draw the line? How much is healthy to connect to the outside validation?
Right. We always talk about mirroring as a very important function in life, right? From very early childhood, and we have a 16-month-old. We see how much that child is deriving a sense of self based on the external validation. Just being seen, feeling seen, is such a core, such an important part of our being, and it starts very, very early in childhood. And in childhood, it's being seen by the people that are closest to me, uh, and most likely, it's the parents. So that's coming from the outside, and that mirroring function is something that we carry with us for the rest of our lives, in the sense that we are dependent on our external environment to see ourselves, just like we would uh, need a mirror, or in today's day, we would need an iPhone to look at ourselves. As a mirror, we need something. We need an external agency to look at us. We can look at different parts of our body through our eyes, but to look at our face, we need an external mirror. So, in that sense of the term, um, to extend that metaphor, um, there is a sense of self that's derived from what's happening around us and how that is reflecting who we are. And but then it becomes very tricky, because I mean, while that is true, then how do we know that the mirror is accurate? How do we know that it's not distorted? How do we know what we are tying ourselves to is a true representation of who we are? How do we know where the boundary is?
And how much choice do we have in that? Because my boss is giving me my external validation, right? That person is there to tell me, am I doing well? Do I have worth in this job? And society is telling me that if you're not a contributor, then you don't have worth. And I didn't choose to be a part of society in a way. I mean, we're all kind of ushered into it. It just happens. And some of us may choose to rebel, but that's still in some ways being dictated by society. Now I'm going against the thing, right? So it's still society sets the rules. And then I decide how I want to engage with them, but I'm still constantly playing off of, and in some ways being controlled by, the same external impetus. And then if you rewind all the way back to childhood, as you were talking about with parenting, I mean, I didn't get to choose whether my parents were accurate mirrors or not, whether they effectively mirrored me and I felt seen with them. So there's a lot of stuff that feels very disempowering about this.
It's true, which is why it's such a tricky conversation to have, because and usually when we enter these conversations, I had a conversation about self-esteem last week as well, with a client who was asking me if I knew someone who struggled with self-esteem, and I said the person is sitting right in front of you. And I shared the story of, basically for 45 minutes I was walking him through all the struggles of self-esteem that I've had, that till date still impact me. Um, they have left scars. And what's interesting with all of those experiences is that it's tied to some external validation. It's tied to an experience of, um, predominantly an experience of shame, that has been painful. And what is also interesting with self-esteem is when I was talking to him about my self-esteem, there were also a lot of good things that happened in the course of the way. There were a lot of positive validation that came. But what significantly impacted my self-worth, somehow the negative emotions. Somehow the self-doubt around my self-worth stayed very strong, because of some difficult experiences that I had. Until date, I carry those difficult experiences with me. So it's a very complex topic to unravel, um, which is why there is no formulaic way of saying, well, this is how we derive our self-worth. It's important to unpack the entire concept of self-worth and self-esteem in order to really understand how to go about reestablishing our sense of self-worth.
So it might be helpful before we dive into actually how to do that, and especially since you brought up the concept of self-esteem, if we just start with what is self-worth and how is that potentially different than what self-esteem? These terms tend to get used interchangeably, but it feels like there could be some nuanced differences that would be important to articulate.
Yeah, I mean, the way that I understand this, and there are different things that we can say about it, different angles we can take. My understanding is that self-worth is the value of yourself. And the feeling of the sense of self-worth is how you value yourself. Self-esteem is more similar to the sense of self-worth, in that esteem means your regard. How you regard something is how you esteem it. You esteem someone highly, or you don't esteem them very much. So how we esteem ourselves is connected to our sense of self-worth. It's how we regard ourselves. And self-worth can sometimes feel bigger than self-esteem because self-esteem tends to fluctuate. And Michael, we were talking about this quite a lot. You were sharing about how self-esteem can fluctuate, but you can also tie that to the sense of self-worth being not very fixed. That my sense of self-worth is fluctuating when I get an email that says, "Great job, man, you're awesome, you killed it," right? Now my sense of self-worth is very high. And then I get an email that says, "By the way, you forgot to do this, and that's, going to cause consequences for us. So, I'm a little disappointed." And that now my sense of self-worth is going down. And sometimes I try to decouple myself and just like, have a stiff upper lip. But that involves another big subject of shutting down my heart. So as a strategy to not be so thrown off by the constant fluctuations in our self-esteem, our sense of self-worth, we are battling with that all the time. And the most effective way to go into battle with our self-worth is by putting on armor. So we think. But when we put on armor, when we armor our hearts, we barricade ourselves and we feel an incredible loneliness. We feel it doesn't actually build our self-worth. It just protects us from some of the damage, which in certain circumstances is necessary. I mean, if somebody's going to abuse you, you need some of that armor, right? But the problem is we take that armor with us wherever we go because we're always afraid that somebody's going to abuse us. And we don't even think about it. We don't think, oh, I'm such a fearful creature. I carry my armor with me all the time because I'm so afraid. We just do it. And we think it makes us tough and that nobody can get to us. But then there are side effects to that. The fulfillment, the tenderness, the sense of being in touch with my heart and having an emotionally rich existence. This doesn't really come very easily when we have the armor. And our workplaces are set up in such a way, don't be so emotional. Don't be so heartfelt. Just kill it. Kill it, man. Take your armor and kill it, right? So what is that doing to us? And it all comes back to self-worth. I'm afraid that my self-worth is going to go down, but that means that there's something wrong, that it's not very fixed. Is self-worth something that should be so fickle, so fragile, that we need the armor to protect it all the time?
Well, to me, this is where the kind of difference between self-esteem and self-worth comes into play, with self-worth kind of being the fact that I am valuable and have worth, actually completely independent of these kind of fickle ups and downs, these fickle, did I get the validation? Did I not get the validation? Did I get the number at the end of the year that I wanted versus did I not get the number at the end of the year? Versus self-esteem being some hopefully objective if we're actually in touch with our own value and have good mirrors in our lives, but self-esteem being more like a measure of how well we are doing. And that can fluctuate with maybe how hard we're working or how much focus we have or the people that we surround ourselves or the job that we have. So it seems to me that it would be helpful to understand that we have self-worth regardless of anything else, and then have self-esteem kind of fluctuate in an accurate manner, kind of depending on how we are actually doing in life.
What you're saying is reminding me a little bit of our the metaphor of the peg and the rubber band that we use with the Enneagram. And it's almost like the peg represents self-worth, where the rubber band represents self-esteem, and there may be more fluctuation. But Michael, what you're talking about is that self-esteem is based on our doing, and self-worth may be based on our being. Is that reflect? Because you're talking about we have self-worth independent of our achievements or whatever we're doing. Self-esteem may be more reflective of our situation and what our achievements are doing. And I don't know if that's a universal definition, but that is what I was gathering from what you were saying. Is that right, or have I misunderstood?
Yeah, I think that characterizes it well, as far as my understanding. Again, so if any of you have a different understanding, that would also be helpful to share. But I think in terms of like having a healthy sense of self-esteem, and Hari, this is what we were talking about, is the ability to kind of accurately get in touch with how am I doing. So somebody might have a very good sense of self-esteem, and that's because things are going well and I'm also accurately assessing that. Whereas those same things might be going well, but I might undervalue that. I might have a much lower opinion of how I'm doing, and so that we would call somebody like that, we would say somebody who has that going on, that they have a low sense of self-esteem, somebody who undervalues themselves.
So I would even expand the scope of self-esteem and say that there are different levels to it, right? Just as you're pointing at self-worth, and I'd sort of alluded to this in the beginning as well, that there's maybe a deeper quality about it. There's some intrinsic value to human life, whereas self-esteem feels a little different. And at the same time, we can be in touch with that intrinsic human value and esteem ourselves accordingly on one level. And then on another level, check out, well, how am I matching up to that value? So self-esteem doesn't have to be so cut and dry, that it can exist on different levels and coexist. So for example, I may feel one day that I'm, a worthy human being. And at the same time, I did something that was unworthy of my being a worthy human being. So now there's a coexistence of two kinds of self-esteem that we might even say are healthy, because it's healthy to own up to something. It's healthy to take responsibility and be humbled when we do something wrong. And that, may not feel as good. Our esteem for ourselves may go down in a way. But because there's this baseline that is always present, it doesn't wreck us, right? So the self-esteem is not so straight that there's only one way of esteeming ourselves. There is a healthy way that we can actually perceive ourselves from different platforms. I'm also thinking about how, you have certain celebrities, very, very successful business people, executives. They should have an incredible sense of self-worth, right? But what you often find is they're the most armored people. And sometimes they're interviewed in a magazine or on a talk show or wherever, and they look really attractive and they look so confident. I mean, we show a clip of Tiger Woods, who just couldn't be more confident, and people get so inspired by that. It's like, I want to be like that. That must feel so good to never have to question yourself, to never feel low, to believe in yourself to such a degree, to just be like on it and know that you're amazing all the time. He says it's just a belief that you have to have. It's just a belief you have to have, that I'm going to win all the time. Wouldn't that be amazing? But then you see there's a disconnect. How the person lives, it just doesn't give an accurate portrayal. You see, there's so much leaking out. I was talking about the loneliness, the disconnects with myself and with others, the fixations. It needs to find its outlet, and it's pointing at something that idea of self-worth or self-esteem based on what we do, it's not reliable. It doesn't give us a full picture, and it has absolutely nothing to do with the fixed intrinsic value of human life. It may hint at, the possibilities. It may show how we could change the world if we harnessed that self-worth, because look at how capable these people are, look at how capable we can be. But there's so much more, and it's not a direct correlation. It ensnares us in this idea that makes us worship success, and it's completely a materialistic worldview that is so unconscious, so conditioned for all of us. We don't even know it's happening most of the time.
If I were to, I wanted to key in on two things that you had said, Hari. One is you started with, you'd see all of these famous people and who have achieved so much, or business people who are highly successful, and you would think that they would have the highest degree of self-worth. And that is, if you assume that self-worth is actually tied to a material plane or our achievements. So you, and what you, as you spoke, that breaks down. What you're saying is that it breaks down. Self-worth is not, we think it's tied to our achievements, but it falls apart. And so it's actually, self-worth is something that goes well beyond what we're doing, what we've achieved, what external value we have.
And yet it's so glittery that it attracts us. And sometimes we don't see or refuse to see how it breaks down. We don't even recognize the amount of suffering in the people that we admire most, who don't show us their suffering willingly.
Yeah. Yeah. The other thing you said is we're about being armored. So almost that you can't feel if you're armored, that is divergent from feeling your self-worth. Because if you felt your self-worth, you could actually you could just show up as you are. You would be comfortable in who you are without needing to put on an armor, be a projection of yourself, project an image, etc. And so that points to something very specific regarding one's self-worth.
And I think this is what makes this so difficult for so many people, is because we have the stories of ourselves. I know I definitely have this story of myself, which is that it's kind of good that I have low self-worth, because now I'm super motivated. I'm actually out there like pushing myself, because I think if I ever felt, oh no, I'm in touch with my self-worth, I have a healthy sense of self-esteem, the story in my head, which I can see how it's false and yet it still drives me all the time, is that I would all of a sudden become this lazy person who wouldn't actually be interested in going out and trying to accomplish things and build things and make new things and meet people and, you know, all of these things that we're doing all the time. That motivation would somehow go away if I all of a sudden became in touch with my self-worth.
Yeah, it's and then I was having a conversation with a client yesterday about this very topic, on not exactly self-worth, but how certain emotions can actually become drivers. And inherent in that was this whole thing about not feeling worthy enough, and so that becomes a driving force. Now, what we see invariably, is that while that can maybe get us started, it's not a sustainable force. It has such a stressful effect on our entire way of being, so much so that at some point in time we question, well, is this the way to go? And then somehow we need to convince ourselves. And this is the interesting thing: when we do not find anything else to motivate us, this is the only fuel that's left.
And is it a reliable fuel? Is it a sustainable one? And when is it ever enough?
When we have these conversations, what I sense in the conversations itself is like, yeah, you know, this really motivates me. And then when the person is saying that, you also see how the person is saying it and simultaneously doubting doubting his or her of his assertion of that too, because I know, I feel its effects. I know how draining it is to always be chasing after my own sense of worth. So that's one thing. The second thing that we were talking about in that same conversation I was alluding to a little earlier is the effect, the price that other people have to pay for that. Because at some point in time, my sense of self-worth becomes a relativized element, because that's the only way I can find some level of connection with self-worth. So what I have to do is, one, compare, but number two is, if I can show that other people are less than me, then somehow I feel I have a sense of self-worth. This is tricky, because then I am taking away somebody's self-worth for gaining my own, which goes back to the whole spirit of competition that we experience so much in our culture. It does create suffering. There is a price that somebody else pays to keep my self-worth intact.
There are winners and losers.
Right? And this is, again, the risk of externalizing our sense of self-worth, is that there is a price to pay, both for ourselves in terms of the stress that we experience, and then for others who have to somehow, without their choice, have to give up their sense of self-worth for me to feel better about myself. And that's it's a natural outcome of externalizing my sense of self-worth.
I was thinking about Hari and I were having a conversation with someone that we both work with around, and he was saying that, if you really want to get me to do something, just tell me I can't do it. And then I will prove you wrong. And, Hari asked this amazing question, which was, well, do you feel like you're being controlled then? Because all I have to do is tell you you can't do something, and then I'm making you, and the conversation went on to talk about, well, only when he himself wants to do those things, so he has to be aligned with them. But there's this element of, of control, and I am at the behest of needing to prove to others to feel my worth and my value, and that's
it's true.
The other thing I was thinking about this, Michael, what you'd said about laziness, like if I feel my sense of worth, well, I'm done, I'm not driven anymore. And I think that the way that I have experienced this, it's not like one's ambition goes away. It's just that the object of that ambition changes. So in organizational settings, we spend so much time trying to align an individual's incentives with the organizational's incentives, because we recognize that everyone's sort of out for themselves because they need to prove their worth. And so I spent and there are all these little mini divergences within the organization where we're not all working in a unified, cohesive manner towards the organization's best interests. I'm working for my best interests and the organization's, maybe 50-50. And that's happening for thousands of people. What kind of sort of loss factor is there when that's happening? Now, all of a sudden, what happens if I'm truly in touch with my worth? If I have that sense of self-worth, I can really work for the benefit of others without needing to work for the benefit of myself all the time, because I'm not there yet myself, but I think just maybe slightly closer to my own self-worth than I may have been years ago. And in seeing that, like I can act more in service of others and the organization. And then what would happen in an organization if everyone were more in touch with their self-worth? Would that organization get lazy and just shut down, or would that organization thrive in a way that you've never seen?
And also, when we talk about this idea that, like, well, I'll do this because it's aligned with my values, where do those values come from? Is there not an element of control in how we value things, right? That's the overarching piece that is so crazy. I mean, it's mind-boggling. How do you navigate that? Where is freedom when society is set up this way, when we've been raised a certain way? Coming back full circle. So to work and to act and to live with real freedom, it requires something tremendously different. It has to be so off the grid from what is our experience currently, where it's like, you tell me what my worth is, and I tell myself if I value what I want to do, but where do those values come from? It comes from a collection of people's values. So we have to really, to decouple self-worth from achievement, it requires a lot. I mean, the detangling runs deep, man.
To me, that brings up the biggest question, which again may seem very existential, perhaps even philosophical.
Yes.
When we talk about self-worth, and it is an existential experience, right? When we talk about self-worth, it's, well, when my stock price, quote unquote, my stock price falls, it has a very existential effect to it. But then the important thing here is to ask the question, well, what is this? Which self are we talking about? And so much of our work at our build is actually fundamentally based on the premise of the self and understanding the self. And my experience of this is the self shows up in two ways. The self that we typically talk about is what we call the egoic self. Um, the self that needs an external validation for the sake of establishing its identity and feeling its identity constantly. And then we talk about the true self, which is much deeper than the egoic self. Um, and the egoic self uh, is covering the true self in a certain way. So when we talk about the self and me, I, or my sense of self-worth, typically our conversations are around the egoic self. That sense of self that is in constant need of external validation for the sake of experiencing itself, and to establish its identity very strongly. So if we are talking about that egoic self, then a lot of questions are raised, and our understanding of the egoic self is that um, uh, the egoic self is never really satisfied. It it's like feeding somebody that's constantly hungry. The more food you put, the more it requires because of its fragility, because its existence depends so much on the constant feeding. It's fragile. It doesn't have its own existence. It doesn't have a sense of its own self. That fundamentally defines the ego. And so when it's so fragile, then naturally a sense of self-worth that's based on the ego is fragile. And it experiences its fragility, because of which it needs a constant sense of external validation. This also ties back to your point, Michael. The ego is afraid of 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 becoming healthy, becoming strong, because then what is its purpose, right? It somehow the ego derives its sense of self from being fragile, and that becomes its driving force. But it doesn't. There's something wrong with it, and it knows it. It feels it. And so now I can't really determine what I would do if I didn't experience my fragility, quote unquote, what we call drive. Because then what will motivate me to work in the world? So the bigger question here is, what self are we talking about? Are we talking about the egoic self, or are we talking about our truest self?
I feel like it's appropriate to talk about your feeding the cage metaphor here, because you're talking about feeding the ego, and that's what's coming to my mind about we're feeding the cage and not the bird inside.
So then the question arises, well, how do we, first of all, how do we even come in touch with the bird? Because the cage is all that we see and experience on a day-to-day basis. And if that's what we experience on a day-to-day basis, then how do we even know what the difference between the cage and the bird is? For so many of us, myself included, what I experience is the cage. I don't even see the bird. I don't experience the bird. And so my actions and my drive for self-worth is completely based on that cage. That's the challenge that we experience.
So where does that leave us?
Well, it's a it's a work. It's a work in progress, and I think what's important here is to not neglect the egoic self, but actually, the egoic self is a means to actually go towards the true self, but it's not the true self. And so, what's important is that the egoic self is actually built in a healthy fashion. That it's and this is what brings us to the deeper definition of maybe self-esteem and self-worth, is in order for us to let go of the egoic self. And this is what Richard Rohr talks about in his book Falling Upward. And he talks about two halves of life. He talks about the first half of life being the work of building that healthy egoic self. And then that becomes the platform on which the second half of life, which is actually letting that egoic self fall by the wayside so that we can experience our true self, can be done. So the work here, to begin with, is to actually build that healthy sense of self, or the healthy sense of egoic self, because the ego needs the ego needs enough to be able to let go. But the question that we have to ask ourselves is, what is the point at which we can let go? We don't really intentionally, deliberately draw that line, because everything is so relativized. And so what's important for us is to ask, well, okay, how much of validation, how much of sense of self-worth that I derive from the external world is enough? After which, I put a cap, and then the pursuit goes in a different direction. Prasad, I saw.
No, the challenge is that's like being in quicksand and saying like, okay, now I'm just going to jump out after I reach a certain level. I've fallen in, I'm down to my knees now, and now I'm going to jump out because I'm at the knee point. The thing is, this stuff is so sticky, right? The moment you engage with that mentality, it is so sticky, and it can be arrogant to think, okay, now I have full control. I've gotten to this level and I'm done, finished. I am so disciplined and so good. That it really invites, yes, we need a certain amount of accomplishment. We need a certain amount of validation. But in what way are we approaching it? Because if we approach it in the same way and just say, well, this will be my stopping point, there is like a 99% chance that we will not be able to stop, or we will forget that we were even trying to stop, and we'll end up in a completely different place, and we'll be buried with the game, the ego game. And it's interesting because Carl Jung had come up with this paradigm that is so powerful, which Richard Rohr draws from, of the two halves of life, and needing to build up a healthy sense of self within the world, the ego, so that you're not constantly insecurely looking for the thing that you're attached to that you didn't get. Because if you have a pain in your side, the only thing you can think about is stopping that pain. So if you have a pain in your ego, the only thing you can think about is stopping that pain, just getting some satisfaction. Yes, this person likes me. Yes, I made something happen. Yes, I feel good about myself. That becomes the fixation. So, but interestingly, and then again, as we said, so when you feel like you're no longer in that amount of pain, that you can think a little bit more broadly, then you can give up the ego gradually, right? So there is definitely something to that. Interestingly, he also was sort of lamenting that he hadn't invested enough in the self. he had done all of this incredible work at sort of distinguishing the self from the ego in a way. I mean, he had his own frameworks, but he was so good with understanding the psychology and giving some helpful roadmaps. And at the same time, he was dissatisfied that he hadn't invested enough in the self. So we can work at breaking down our egos like crazy, or we can work at building up our egos so that we can break them down, which is even further removed, right? But at a certain point, we have to ask ourselves, when am I going to invest in what really is the actual self? That is so, I mean, that's what everything hinges on. And then when you invest in that, how much more strength do we have to give up what is external, what is the ego covering to the self? When we build up the strength internally, feeding the bird becomes so powerful it can break out of the cage. And it also goes back to your point about mirroring, Rasanath, that you know, when you're mirrored by people who see your actual self and are pouring into your actual self, that's a wonderful, wonderful starting point, right? As long as we are mirrored by people that are looking at our egos, they're reinforcing the hall of mirrors that this world gives us. And that's what's happening nonstop, all the time. It's just constant. So we have to, again, break out of this. And a great starting point is there anybody that sees me for my real self? And what does that even mean? And that becomes really a spiritual question.
Yeah, I was thinking that in order to even begin to decouple worth from achievement, you have to believe that I have worth independent of achievement. And then you really, at least as far as I can see, what is the basis for that? Either that I have worth, just human life is equally worthy across the board. So I have, but in the world, in the environment that we live in, we don't actually believe that. In the conditioned environment, it doesn't feel like all lives have equal worth. I mean, there's lots that we can say about that. But the other sort of basis for feeling that I have worth that's independent of my doing, that's independent, it's just based on my being, you end up down a spiritual platform of like, that is the basis for my worth, which is that I am a soul, I'm spirit, and that spirit is connected to something much larger, and that's the basis for my worth. And so yeah, you end up, you can't think about this without stepping into a spiritual paradigm.
Yeah, because otherwise, by default, it's social Darwinism. And it's happening unbeknownst to us, where we're saying, you know, if only this guy was motivated to work hard like I am, then he wouldn't be such a loser. The problem is I'm surrounded by incompetent people that just don't get it. They don't have the drive. And, you know, so my basic philosophy there, it's unstated, but only the strong survive. Either you get it or you don't. And you know, evolution made us this way, and it's a good thing. So let me be one of the strong. But then it becomes hypocritical to talk about equal rights and equality. I'm such an egalitarian and a humanitarian, and I just, you know, I care about the state of the world and people. Why? You know, if there are some people that are going to die out because, and we don't take it to this extreme, but this is what it's pointing at. If some people are going to die out because they're weak, but I'm going to be the strong one, what does that say about my care for humanity?
Well, the response typically to something like that is, well, I need them. So I have to keep them interested enough so that then I can feel like I can, like I can derive my sense of worth from, those people. So like you have to become big, but only just big enough that then others are interested enough in the game so that, and this just seems, it seems sadistic, doesn't it? You keep others alive for your own sense of self-worth. There is no love. There is no genuine relationship in that kind of a worldview. There is no selflessness in that kind of a worldview.
And you can't have equality because it doesn't make sense. As Vipin was saying, like, we are not all equal. We are not all equal contributors to the world. We don't have all the same morality, the same level of high morals. We don't have the same level of output. Like, there is constant inequality just based on how we are. And you cannot equalize it. So it becomes just a wishful thinking that sounds nice. So unless there's some spiritual fabric, then all of this is just an intellectual exercise to make us feel good about ourselves, that we are caring and moral people, which we want to be, which is good. We should want to be that. But what is it based on? Does it hold up?
One of the things that's been a helpful framing for me in this is thinking about intentions and how even below the surface of different qualities in people's moral character is still a pure intention somewhere buried there, like this desire. And I think this is where, again, we're kind of moving into the spiritual here, but this desire for unconditional love and this desire to actually be able to give unconditional love and this feeling of connectedness that we all have, even below any sort of difference in moral character, that actually exists for everyone, even the serial killer. And so if we can get in touch with that, we can start seeing how self-worth is, we can start to detangle the link here between self-worth and achievement.
Yeah, the self-worth exists. We're just not able to see it. It's there. It's inherent. Yes. And the whole struggle of searching for self-worth is that we are out of touch with our sense of self, with ourself. And when we are out of touch with ourself, then how do we know what the self is worth?
Exactly.
That's where fundamentally it starts. And so now, then in the process of actually reclaiming it, unfortunately, then we try to reclaim it in ways that doesn't necessarily get us in touch with that self. But also in the process of trying to reclaim it, we also perhaps, and this is true for why we see so much suffering in the world, is that in the unhealthy pursuit of my self-worth, I actually tend to destroy a lot of people's self-worth. So I don't think we have, in that sense of the term, I don't think we have a choice but to actually try and get in touch with our real self. So that's the starting point.
I think maybe closing with what's at stake if we don't. I guess that's what you're pointing at, that we'll just we will destroy other people's self-worth in the process. But what's at stake for ourselves also?
One of the things is that we actually go after the wrong things. We start working on problems that are going to get us that immediate feeling of validation or that immediate feeling of worth, but in the long run, those aren't the things that we should actually be spending our time on.
Yeah, they won't satisfy us. The self is is interesting. We talked about the ego being hungry, but the self is even hungrier. The self is saying, when will you feed me, right? So the ego is, now you got two hungry people because the ego is never satisfied and the self hasn't even been touched. So that's where you get this kind of vacuousness, and we avoid it like anything. We avoid it. We try to fill it up with things that will distract us, things that will self-medicate and numb us. The armor has to be on so heavy. We pride ourselves in our armor and our fighting ability, but we feel so empty, and that's the reason for all of that. Who wants to live with that emptiness? I mean, every day I pick up a news story and it's just about emptiness. It's just about how people are experiencing so much emptiness. It's not stated in those terms, but the only way you can explain the actions of the people in the news are because of this extraordinary, inconquerable emptiness that needs to be filled so desperately. I mean, that is everywhere. That is like in the highest echelons of society. That is the most successful people in all spheres of life. Not to say that you can't be successful or be extraordinarily successful and not be empty, but that's usually not the driving force. What gets us there is the emptiness. And this TED Talk that I referred to so frequently, which we've screened, Gabor Mate's The Power of Addiction, the Addiction of Power, beautifully illustrates this point. If you're expecting that some leader of our society is going to step in and save us from the path of devastation that we've paved for ourselves, think again. There is no way. Because to get to that, first of all, that's like taking the responsibility off of our shoulders and our contribution. We have to actually live exemplary lives. And he makes that point very nicely. But secondly, if you think about the people that are emerging, the people that make it to the top, they're the people that feel that vacuum so strongly. There is an insatiable appetite to do more and more and more, to prove that I am enough, that now I have worth, and it never ends. So we're trusting those people with our well-being, and they're not seeing us for who we are. They're seeing us as objects for them to prop themselves up, to have their sense of self-worth. That is dangerous. And so we may be with a smaller appetite, we may have less proving than the people that we read about or hear about or watch. But, you know, the disease is the same. It's just about how out of control the disease is, but we still have the same disease, myself included. And it is a constant work in progress to treat it. There needs to be a treatment plan for getting rid of this vacuum, filling it with something that will not just like make it fall into a black hole. Actually, feeding the self is the greatest need. Otherwise, we'll forever be thinking, oh, if I move here, if I only had this spouse, if I have this bank account, if I have this setup in my life, if only there weren't this pandemic, then I would be happy. Then I would have enough feeling of worth. It doesn't work. It never works. It never works. There's always something more. And we think, oh, well, that's what makes life exciting. That, you know, I don't know what the next adventure is to be had to get to the goal. And if I were to get to the goal, then what would be the point of my life? Then I could stop living, right? So I'm always chasing. But it's a treadmill. It's a hamster in a wheel. It's not what it promises to be. And I always give the example of George Harrison, because I'm so inspired by his conclusion that he reached the top and he said, are you kidding me? This is it? This is what everybody dreams of? This is what everybody thinks, like in my wildest imagination, if only? He said, I don't want anything to do with this. And he actually invested in his real self. He became such an ardent spiritualist and a songwriter for self-realization. That's incredible. And he's not the only person that's come to that conclusion. But it's a very, very powerful example because it can stop us in our tracks. We don't have to wait until we get there, because we're probably not going to get to his height of success before we say, wait a minute, is this really what I'm after? Is this really what I need?
And bringing it back to, Richard Rohr's concept of the first half of life, the second half of life, even if we are on the first half of life, and even if we are trying to fill up some of the needs of the ego, we can still very much have our eyes on the second half of life.
It's hard to build the first half of life in a healthy way without having our eyes on the second half.
Mm-hmm.
That's it. That's the approach I was talking about.
That's the key. It's impossible to do it. You have to have your eyes on the long-term goal in order to even build things in short term that are aligned with what's in the long term. Now, while they may look very differently externally, because our eyes and our hearts are actually focused on the second half, the first half will be built for that purpose. So you're absolutely right that we are going about our lives and we still need to work with our egoic selves, not neglect it, as I mentioned earlier, but with the understanding that we are building it for the sake of getting in touch with our real self, and not for its own standalone purpose, because that is where the problem is.
And we're skeptical about what we're building as we're building it. We don't invest. We're not building this house of cards thinking the wind will never blow, the wind will never blow, the wind will never blow. This is it. Oh, finally, I got the last card in place. We're building the house of cards so that when the wind blows, we say, oh, I knew all along that this wasn't the real thing. I just needed to do my project so that I would be satisfied. At least I tried.
Beautiful. Well, that feels like a really nice place to close. I know we could talk about this topic for hours.
We do.
Yeah.
Thank you all. Always
Thank
nourishing.
you guys.
Very nourishing.